Initial impression by David Longhorn. Editor's note: the following story was found among the effects of the late John Atkinson Grimwade, arguably the most successful British horror writer of our time. As with all of the author's works, it had been written in longhand. It was then prepared as a formal manuscript on an imperial manual typewriter, the same machine upon which Grimwade wrote all his classic novels and short fiction. Along with the typescript, I found a note from my lifelong friend and client instructing me to make this story available on the internet at the stroke of midnight, GMT, on October 31st. I confess that, at the time, I was struck by the peculiarity of the request. Grimwade had always expressed utter contempt for all things digital, hence his reliance on antiquated technology in the production of his novels and short stories. For him to insist that his last work should be freely available as an electronic download struck me as bizarre. But of course, at the time, I was preoccupied with more urgent matters. I had gone to Grimwade's apartment in the pleasant heart of Canterbury, anticipating business as usual. For nearly 40 years, I had been visiting Grimwade at progressively more salubrious addresses, seeking to winkle out of him his latest tour de force. My old friend would have been the first to admit that he was not always an easy client. I could never be sure what he would have for me. Would it be a finely crafted tale of supernatural horror, such as Venus with 6 fingers or the Bloody Glass? Or might it be another of the paperback pot boilers my friend churned out under a bewildering array of pen names, Frank Trencherman, Royce Rollison, Lee Grant to name but 3, throughout his career? Grimwade affected to despise the pulp fiction that paid his bills. And what literary man could be proud of novels like Gloria's Gory Go-Go Girls, The Brain Ripper Chronicles, or A Fistful of Gonads? Yet he always talked over their plots and key incidents with a certain lip-smacking relish. As the world now knows, what I found was my friend's body, his hand still clutching the fateful glass that he had drained of poison. And on his Regency credenza lay the story you are about to read. My initial impression was that it is not especially good, and I have to admit that it has not grown upon me to any discernible degree. However, a friend's last request should be honored. I am sure some will make a great deal of the fact that I am mentioned directly in this tale. It was typical of Grimwade to make jokes at my expense, and I am sure many fans are already aware that I appear, usually quite thinly disguised, in several of his books. I am eviscerated in high jinks at Slosham Hall, gradually dismembered in Choppy-Go-Lucky, and unceremoniously pushed into a rotary cultivator by the eponymous antihero of Nasty Nick. I never took these fictional assassinations seriously, and reports that they always followed disputes over advances have been greatly exaggerated. I feel sure that other, more discerning critics, will see that the author's insistence that his last work of fiction is in fact nothing of the sort, and falls into a hallowed literary tradition. To blur the distinction between artifice and reality is hardly new. Enjoy the story for what it is, gentle reader, a flight of fancy by a remarkable author who, for reasons still unclear, decreed that it must be his swan song. Aubrey Jolien, Senior Editor, Gorlock Books. Very nervous? Yes, of course. But that is only natural. I am embarking upon a perilous voyage. I am going to that bourne from which no traveler returns, as the bard puts it. Very overrated, Shakespeare, in my opinion. But one can't say such things when one is alive. Odd that imminent death should feel so liberating. But I digress. Every great venture begins with a sacrifice. In this case the sacrifice is not my mortal coil, which that gormless clown Jolien will discover in an hour or so after I finish typing this. I only hope he doesn't drop dead from shock on the spot. He is so very unhealthy, with his great fat belly and boozer's nose. But even if he does perish, this manuscript will be found and someone will do what is necessary. Now, to get back to my point, it is not my body that I am giving up in a bargain with the greatest, closer of all. It is, as more astute readers will have already guessed, my immortal soul that I have signed away. And that is why I am writing this story, which is not a story, it is a work of fact disguised as fiction. Intrigued? Gentle reader, soon you will be amazed. And then appalled, and quite probably terrified. But only for a little while. The unusual journey I have taken began with a vague disgust for life that slowly grew to embrace everything. For years now, I have found writing detailed descriptions of protracted suffering and violent death extremely cathartic. It's not just fat, old Jolien I kill over and over again. My idiot relatives, my cretinous neighbors, the low-life scum whose drunken carousing outside the Green Man interrupts my work, leisure time, or sleep, all perish, again and again, in my stories. Silly? Perhaps. But then we are very silly little creatures, we humans. Some of us fondly style ourselves masters of the universe, while most put faith in some caring deity or other. But I have become convinced that, while there is a God of sorts, he, she, or it has long since absconded from this realm. We have been left to the not very tender mercies of a rather different order of being. Ah, but that's just old-fashioned cynicism, an easy pose to strike for a rich man like you. True, I have always been something of a cynic. I could not churn out a steady stream of drivel about psychopaths and Satanists if I were not. But anyone who has read my best work closely will know that I am a little more thoughtful than the dimwits who devour my garish bestsellers. To be honest, I have no respect whatsoever for my audience. They're even stupider than Jolien, by and large. Isn't that deliciously shocking? But seriously, anyone who wants to spend their time reading trash like Citadel of Putrefaction must be a congenital imbecile, or at most only slightly higher on the evolutionary scale. As for the pimply, pubescent morons who flock to see clumsy, low-budget film adaptations of my potboilers, trash such as Zombie Bikers Must Die or Kiss the Blood Off My Chainsaw, well, once I would have despaired for the future of civilization. Once. A writer is a slave to his readership, after all, and yet he is at the same time a tyrant. He commands them to read his words, drink deep of the wine of his imagination. And they do. Yet, if he makes a single misstep, he risks breaking the spell. Then he becomes unfashionable, his books are remaindered, and people start asking, is old, what's his name, still writing, then? I thought he died years ago. No, for all that it offers the odd flicker of satisfaction, a writer's life is at best precarious and at worst miserable. If you are foolish enough to socialize, people find out what you do and generally come up with either of two responses. One is to ask you where you get your ideas. The other is to offer you a surefire bestseller, guaranteed smash hit, so all you have to do is write it. And they generously undertake to split the proceeds 50-50, of course. I stopped going to parties a long time ago. Again, though, I digress. Humor an old man. And a condemned man at that. Condemned by myself, it is true, but still. On the one hand, the imminent transition to another state of being is exhilarating, but on the other, it does make one a trifle giddy. Focus, Johnny. Get it done. What looms is, after all, your last and greatest deadline. So, what am I playing at? Why this rambling account of my state of mind just before I throw a 7, to coin a barbarous phrase? What could prompt a man of wealth, a middle-ranking celebrity, an author who has yet to lose his mass appeal, to commit self-murder? A man who might well, in fact, have lived to 100 in comfort. Perhaps the balance of his mind is disturbed. Writers do tend to go a bit barmy in their declining years, I agree. Many sink into drink-sodden decrepitude, brains decaying along with their livers. But, as Jolien can attest, I have never overindulged in alcohol or any other stimulant. Equally easy to blame is sex, of course. Or rather, the lack of it. I would not be the first man in late middle age to sink into a depression over declining potency. But I had my fair share of erotic encounters in my younger days. So many adorable young things at conventions willing to drop in on me at my suite, usually bringing a bottle, invariably offering their bodies to some extent. No, I have my memories. Having amassed a fortune in fleshly joy, I could live on the interest for many years more. Sex, alcohol, drugs, does nothing else interest this man? I have already stated my disgust for my own species, at this shoddy Barnum and Bailey world I am forced to inhabit. In my books I exact extravagant revenge on individuals, groups, and mankind in general. But some 10 years ago, an idea, absurd on the face of it, popped into my head. Or, more likely, was put there. The notion that I might call upon the dark forces I had so often been forced to imagine was the tiny grain of sand in the oyster of my imagination. Around it formed a very dark and lustrous pearl, a jewel fit for the Prince of Darkness himself, in fact. It was very simple. I had spent many years researching all things arcane and occult so as to make my book seem authentic. Of course, I had faked and fudged all over the place, changing genuine spells and curses to better fit my plots. At first I had felt a kind of jovial contempt for people who really believed such stuff, Satanists, Wiccans, and the like. Then one night I woke, perhaps during the witching hour itself, with the realization that I was now equipped to be a genuine sorcerer. But could any of it really work? First, I attempted a few simple curses. The raucous drunks spilling out of the pub opposite my flat were permanently silenced when a night bus plowed into them as they waited to cross the street. The bus driver later swore that a thing with a horrible face startled him, causing him to lose control of the vehicle. Of course, CCTV footage showed nothing of the kind. The poor man lost his job, sad to say. But he was the first of many pawn sacrifices in a long game, as I tested the limits of my powers. Eventually I grew bored. Yes, I had eliminated a few troublesome individuals. There was the spiteful reviewer who kept sneering at my work, a couple of younger authors who had threatened to eclipse me, a politician whose approach to personal taxation offended me. But then I came to realize that in killing off a few individuals I was really just whiling away my declining years. And, after all, is murder such a great achievement? A mindless virus or a loose roof slate that can kill a man. Even the knowledge that I would never be caught no longer thrilled me. Resolved to achieve something of more lasting value, I returned to my extensive library of occult tomes. I looked more closely at rituals designed to extend one's lifespan and power over the world. It was tempting to think of myself as an immortal tyrant, ruling over a cowed humanity. But even that vision started to pall. Because, in the final analysis, people would still be idiots. One might as well aspire to be emperor of an ant farm. No, better to destroy this pathetic human world, especially if in doing so one could become a superior being. Monstrous? Perhaps I am. But, as I have already remarked, there is something exhilarating about one's imminent demise. After extensive research and some preliminary negotiations, I am convinced that I have found a copper-bottomed way of ending pestiferous mankind. Unless I am very much mistaken, the way in which I can become a god is to bring about the apocalypse. It seems that Lucifer, for all his power, cannot directly intervene in human affairs without a gilt-edged invitation from a mortal. No, don't stop reading. Whatever you do, continue to the end. After all, you want to find out what happens, don't you? Though of course if you are reading this, you will already know a little. Do you know how to bring about the end of the world? One must simply invite the former archangel Lucifer to do his worst, or should that be his best? Come, Satan, destroyer of worlds. That, in essence, is the invocation that I am required to make, though not in English. Odd, but there it is. Latin, it seems, is still the official language of hell. But of course, it is not quite so simple. Otherwise any ranting, half-wit, could bring about Armageddon whenever he stubbed his toe. No, the very precise terms of my contract with the cloven-footed gentleman state that the Latin version of the invocation must be propagated throughout the world in the course of a single day, All Hallows' Eve. What's more, the fatal phrase must be planted in the minds of readers without them realizing that they are being primed for destruction. Impossible, you say? Once I would have agreed with you. But after I have typed the last line of this most contrived of true stories, I will ingest the tincture without a qualm. I am sure that, sooner or later, the invocation will take effect. Perhaps it will come like a single, great lightning bolt. Or, more likely, it will take the form of terminal decay, the final triumph of invincible chaos over this fallen world. The Son of the Morning has not vouchsafed his plans to me in detail. But he strikes me as a very efficient operator, in his way. My only regret is that I never used him properly in any of my books. Editors, afterward, I feel I ought to spell out, to avoid any possible misunderstanding, that the above story is an elaborate joke, an exercise in black humor. It is written in the form of an acrostic, whereby the first letter of each paragraph spells out the supposed invocation Grimwade mentions. To save the reader further trouble, the result is, Venit Satanas Pestifer Mundi. It is of course absurd to suggest that such a cliched and somewhat silly display of diabolism could have any effect, even if it had somehow burrowed into millions of readers' minds without their knowing on Halloween. But I must admit that it is a rather clever idea, that publishing such a story on the internet could bring about the end of the world. But please, do not judge my poor friend too harshly, you who are reading this story days, weeks, or even years after its appearance. Your world is still perfectly intact, is it not? Next story. Closer by Sarah Clancy. A dark figure lurked in the corner of her eyes, like something pressed upon the world instead of a part of it. A stain that marred the depths of the crowd that shoved in around her. Resolutely, she kept her eyes fixed forward, refusing to turn towards the figure. Having taken the same path home every workday for years, she knew the rules of train etiquette well. Keep your eyes forward, mind your own business, and move the second the doors open. So instead, she inched away as far as she could, using the people around her as a shield. The train lurched as it slowed. Her tight grip on the safety rail was the only thing that kept her from being drowned in the flood of bodies squishing in around her, each jostling for position. She used the movement to sneak a glance over her shoulder but couldn't catch sight of the black mass again. The scent of stale sweat and other things she didn't want to name filled her nose as she anxiously waited. She had managed to ignore it for most of the trip, but now, with the platform edging closer at an agonizingly slow pace, the rank, humid air made her stomach cramp. It was impossible to keep from touching the other passengers, especially as they inched ever closer to the doors in restless anticipation. Cheap clothing. Unpleasantly warm flesh. Straying elbows that carelessly jabbed into her ribs. She froze as a new sensation invaded the normal crush. The back of her skull prickled at the gentle scrape of fingernails. The doors opened just as she tried to turn. Cool night air chilled her skin as the flow of the crowd pushed her forward. With renewed determination to avoid whoever was on the train, she gathered her hair over one shoulder and ignored the retreating touch. Moving swiftly to avoid being consumed by the flowing crowd, she passed alongside the train, heading towards the exit stairs. The lights of the train and overhead fluorescents beat back the night as best they could. Still, dark shadows were splayed across the ground and walls. Each one weaker than the figure she had spotted before, but enough to make her flinch. She kept her gaze locked straight ahead. It didn't stop her attention being captured by the figure again. It flicked across the corner of her eyes, gone almost as quickly as she spotted it. But the sensation of being watched lingered. It played across her skin like a wave of needles. Gathering her coat tightly around herself, she rushed up the stairs. Reaching the bridge that arched over the rails didn't extinguish the sensation, only lessened it. Keeping a brisk pace, she adjusted her purse strap and took a sobering breath of the night air. Still, a cold lump formed in the pit of her stomach, making it a struggle to keep her head high. A part of her wanted to look back. But humoring the sensation would only give it meaning. So she focused instead on getting away from the station and clearing her mind. Each step brought a dull throb of pain as her work shoes rubbed against her heels. It made her wince as she took the flight of stairs down to get back onto street level. Soon. She whipped around as the single whispered word hit her ears. One hand had shot out to grip the railing. A chill lingered to the metal and worked its way into her palm as she searched the faces of the people shuffling to get around her. None of them acknowledged her beyond a slight glance of annoyance. A gentle breeze blew again, and she convinced herself that was all it was. A strange phenomenon caused by fraying nerves. Nothing more. Swallowing thickly, she turned back around and continued on her way. This side of the station was almost as populated as the train itself. Traffic was a steady strum through the streets while both sides were filled with restaurants and bars. As her fellow travelers dispersed around her, they were near instantly replaced with people searching for their friends or food. Different scents filled the air, reminding her of how hungry she was. Weaving through the crowd, she twisted to avoid a couple that had suddenly stopped short. That's when she noticed the figure from the train. It remained still as the world seemed to swirl around it. She only had a split second to recognize that it was there before the crowd swallowed it back up and she lost sight of it again. People bumped into her, shoving her back and forth, snapping her out of her shocked stupor. Clutching her bag to her side, she rushed forward with renewed determination. Her skin crawled over her bones. Her heart beat wildly around her chest even as she struggled to dismiss the figure as merely a trick of the light. For 2 streets, moving through the crowd was like pushing against a tide. The relatively short distance took far too long. She just wanted to be home. Finally, making it to the corner where the stoplight made it possible to cross the road, she joined the crowd already massing. Once more, people pushed in around her. But without the confines of a train, they were able to keep a little more distance between each other. She knew this logically. That didn't stop her from feeling like they were only a breath away from her back. She could almost feel the heat of someone's hand hovering between her shoulder blades. Twitching as if she could physically dislodge the sensation, she pushed her hair over her shoulder. Just the barest of a turn and it was there again. Lurking in the corner of her eyes. Her spine straightened. The figure was closer than it had been before, but still had no real detail. No hair or arms or face. It was nothing more than an ebony smear in the edges of her peripheral vision. As subtly as she could, she shifted, fussing with her purse strap for an excuse to look back. A spike of fear lodged in her lungs as the thought bubbled into her mind that her pursuer would be encouraged by any form of acknowledgement. Keeping to her ruse, she fiddled with her shirt as she turned a little more. But as she tried to inch the figure out of the corner of her eyes, it drifted. Explanations and excuses flooded her mind as to why the figure would do this, but none of them were comforting. She struggled to keep her breathing even as the point of darkness seeped behind her, only to re-emerge and settle once more on the very edge of her blind spot. Soon. The word froze her blood as the walk light flicked on. The raspy voice echoed with a chilling certainty in her ears, making sure that she had heard it. She raced forward, pushing her way past a few people in front of her. Angry grunts followed her. A few muttered words. She didn't pay attention to either. Her nerve endings felt like live wires, each one screaming at her to get some distance from her pursuer. But there was a price to pay. As she neared her home, the stores grew scarce, the streetlights more scattered, and the crowds thinned. Without the competing noise, she could hear how labored her breathing was. The hitch and strain. It created a self-fulfilling loop, the sound feeding her fear and making her breath harder. Her shoes clicked against the sidewalk. A quick, repetitive rhythm that bounced off of the surrounding buildings. Gradually, the beat changed. Doubled. Signaling that someone else was on the street behind her. It started as a scraping shuffle. Barely distinguishable under her own rapid pace. Soon it was louder, closer. Not daring to look behind, she walked faster. The shuffle matched her pace. Every heartbeat heard, pounding like a drum, urging her to run. Her skin tightened over her bones and her muscles twitched, but she kept her pace, her eyes locked on the approaching street corner. As calmly as she could, she turned the corner. The instant the brick edge worked to hide her from her followers' sight, she broke into a sprint. Her lungs burned within moments. The pain swept into her legs soon after. But she kept pushing forward, clutching her bag to her chest to keep it from battering against her side or being used as a handle to drag her back. The shuffle became a lumbering scrape. For all that it sounded like the figure was hobbling, it was fast. No matter how hard she pushed herself, it was a losing battle to keep her lead. The scrape drew nearer, grew louder, the sound driving her into a blinding panic. Racing around another corner, she spotted her apartment building in the distance. Lights shone in the windows like beacons, promising safety, sanctuary. She shoved her hand into her purse and scrambled for her keys. Clutched the slips of metal until they dug into her palm. It occurred to her between heartbeats that she was leading the figure right to her home, but fear kept her barreling towards the building. The shuffling, scraping, lurching footsteps grew closer. Closer. Haggard breathing that wasn't her own filled her ears. Hot breath pushed against the back of her neck. With a shattered cry, she whipped around and slashed her hand out, using the keys as knife. They met no resistance. Her hand was left to fall uselessly to her side as she stared down the dark, deserted street. Noises drifted to her from the restaurants. The general buzz of surrounding life hovered around her. But the street itself was empty. Shaken, she rushed up the staircase and pushed her way through the security door. As it clicked shut behind her, the little whirl of machinery telling her that the lock had fastened, she let out a sigh of relief. The small, annoying rub of her shoes had turned into a painful fire after the run. So she slipped her shoes off before climbing the long, narrow stretch of stairs. It was a hard slog to make it up the flight. Her legs were heavy and her lungs burned. Reaching the landing, she turned to go down the hall. That's when she saw it. A patch of black standing at the base of the stairs. Pain forgotten, she raced down the hallway, fingers fumbling with her apartment keys. The slow, steady shuffle of feet climbed the stairs behind her. At her door, her hands shaking, unable to fit the key into the lock, she glanced back. The hallway was empty. The shuffling continued. She looked back at the door, desperate to fit the key. It was there. In the corner of her eyes. The edge of her vision. She snapped her head up, a scream lingering on the tip of her tongue but failing to come. The hallway was empty. Silent but for the scratches of her key searching for the lock. The abrupt jerk of it slipping it into place lurched her forward, her shoulder smacking against the door. Now. Her gaze shot towards the noise. It was there, standing beside her, filling her peripheral vision with an inky black. She tried to jerk away but found herself frozen in place. Her mind screamed to move, to run, but her muscles wouldn't listen. Each one locked into place as the dark mass spread out within the edges of her vision. It surrounded her. Engulfed her. Hot breath washed over her trembling skin as her field of vision narrowed. Breaking through her shock, she opened her mouth to scream. The darkness rushed forward, latching onto her like thousands of hands that would not let go. She felt herself sucked into it, and she kicked and struggled against the pull. The darkness enveloped her, crawled into her open mouth and stung her eyes as the invisible hands pulled her in and dragged her down into the bottomless abyss. Her scream died as swiftly as it began, leaving only the rattle of her keys swinging in the lock to break the silence of the now empty hallway. The overhead lights burned brightly, chasing away the calm night, ensuring that the shadows could exist only within the corners. Next story. The Sins We Hide by A.I. Nasser. The night I found Ashley Cooper, I almost killed her. She was standing in the middle of the road, arms hanging by her side, hair falling down to her shoulders and damp as if she had just stepped out of the shower and had thought it a good idea to take a midnight stroll down Hellman Drive. As if she had somehow lost her way and had reverted to extreme measures just to get someone's attention. As if she hadn't been missing for 4 years. 4 years. People say nothing ever happens in Gloucester, Connecticut, and I used to believe that. A long time ago. When being the sheriff of this small town involved nothing more than handling disputes between neighbors and the occasional drunk driver, usually Jim Hayes, and always on Sunday night when he'd lose at a game of cards. Not that I was complaining. I loved small-town law. 2 deputies, Martha on the phone, and I was usually back home a bit after sunset with a 6-pack and a few hours in front of the TV to look forward to. Every now and then I'd get called back in, never anything serious, but enough of a ruckus to warrant a visit by yours truly. I can remember every time that had happened, mainly because I could count them on the fingers of one hand. It was routine, really. Wake up, drive the narrow road into town, pick up a bagel and coffee, and end up behind my desk with time to kill. Paperwork was probably the only thing that kept any of us awake, and the routes of course. 4 of them, every 3 hours, letting the little over 2,000 law-abiding citizens of Gloucester know that we were still there, keeping them safe. Not that they needed it. The people of Gloucester were a God-fearing bunch, and every Sunday morning I'd get a call from Pastor Charles Gate, asking if I'd be joining the congregation that week. That my presence would really be missed, and it would be nice to see the familiar face of the law sitting between everyone else in the pews. I'd always thank him, tell him I would try to make it. I never did, though. I had given up on religion the day my daughter died. I wasn't interested in finding God. I had a beef with him, and I had a feeling we weren't going to really hit it off if I ever set foot in Gloucester's first. What I usually ended up doing on Sunday was spend the evening and the better part of the night at Joe's, talking about the Red Sox and trying my best not to call my ex-wife. Never drinking, though. The ride home was long, and Hellman Drive was known for a few twists and turns that always took you by surprise. Not to mention the occasional deer, or if you're really lucky, a parked car with 2 teenagers inside who had somehow decided that making out in the middle of nowhere was a smart idea. I liked my routine. It gave me structure, and after Holly's death, I needed a lot more of that than usual. It was hard coming to terms with cancer, and even harder to think that a 6-year-old should suffer and die the way she had. Structure was good. Routine was important. Without it, I'd have put a gun to my head a long time ago and pulled the trigger. The night I almost ran over Ashley Cooper, standing in the middle of Hellman Drive where no person in their right mind should be standing, that structure was shattered. Along with my windshield and the front half of my truck after I had hit the tree, swerving to avoid her. For years. It had been one of the rare occasions I had been called back into the station. The Coopers had reported their 6-year-old missing, again, and knowing little Ashley, we hadn't been too worried. Everyone knew how adventurous she was, a mini thrill-seeker with an affinity for the woods behind town. The last time she had gone missing, we had found her by the lake at the edge of the woods, skipping rocks and smiling at the ripples they made. I had made that my first stop, and when I didn't find her, had taken to the woods with the others. By day 2, we had called in reinforcements. Divers in the lake, dogs after her scent, and her picture faxed to every station in the neighboring towns. By week 2, everyone across the nation knew Ashley Cooper's name and face, and I had even come across websites created for what had become the search for Loster's lost child. We held a funeral for her after 3 months, when the Coopers had given up completely and winter had come rolling in. I had attended the funeral, had watched Susan Cooper cry a river, holding her husband's arm as he stared off into space as if he were somewhere else. The only one who had really been there was Nancy, the older sister, the high school valedictorian who had been just a few months away from a future at Harvard. Loster had given up on Ashley, but I hadn't. I had spent the rest of the year looking, following any leads, asking around and using all the favors I had with anyone who could point me in the right direction. And still nothing. On the anniversary of her disappearance, I had finally joined the fold, and for the first time since the funeral, visited her grave and apologized. 4 years. She came back after 4 years, and I almost killed her. Cuts and bruises, Sheriff Barker. Dr. Emily Lewis looked up from the chart in her hands, gave me a quick smile, then went back to jotting things down. She'd been responsible for the Loster Medical Center for over a decade now, and she ran it the way she would a fully functioning hospital. So well, in fact, that most of the neighboring towns poured into Loster first, taking her and her staff's recommendations before being transferred somewhere else if needed. She made my job easier, and over the years, we had built a sort of repertoire that had quickly turned into a strong friendship. Her support during Holly's sickness had been one of the reasons I was still a sane man. It didn't mean we never bumped heads. It was part of the charm, really. Like a game of chess, with each one of us trying to enforce our jurisdiction over the other. She usually won. I feel like I shattered a collarbone, I said, wincing as I pulled my coat on. The sheriff's emblem was stitched on, with a brownish shade that made its original yellow color almost obsolete. I felt it was a quaint reflection of the man wearing it. X-rays are clean, Emily said. Unless you want to make the drive into Hartford and get us a CT. I don't think you need one, but hey, if you haven't had enough excitement for one night, knock yourself out. And the girl? I asked. Ashley. The interval between climbing out of my truck and calling in backup was a bit of a blur. All I remember was damp earth, coughing and gasping for breath, and an incredible amount of pain. And Ashley, of course. Standing next to me when I finally looked up, scaring the hell out of me with that stare of hers and the hair that stuck to her face and neck like a second layer of skin. I remember whispering her name, coaxing her into saying anything at all, but all I got was the stare. Eyes following me as I moved, always only a few feet away from me while we waited for the ambulance to pick us up. You need to stop calling her that, Emily said. You already got the paramedics spooked. Come on, Doc, that's Ashley Cooper, I said. You know that better than I do. Hell of a resemblance, sure, Emily nodded. But we're running DNA tests, and we'll see what comes back. How long has it been? 4 years. Too long, I said. I need to call her parents. You definitely do not, Emily said, dropping the chart on my bed and giving me a cold glare that usually preluded an argument. Dennis Barker, you will not give these people false hope. That's Ashley Cooper. I almost yelled. Emily looked around her before pulling the curtains closed around us. Dennis, that is a little girl. A very frightened, admittedly creepy, little girl who is in severe shock. She hasn't said a word since she's come in, and all I could tell by going over the scratches and bruises on her body was that she must have been in those damn woods for a very long time. Exactly, I said. Whoever took her, she must have gotten away. Tried to find her way home. Came to the only place she knew. That's just one theory, Emily argued. Another is that this is a girl who looks a lot like little Ashley, or at least what she would have looked like if we had watched her grow up, and has been lost in those woods for days. Maybe her parents are looking for her. Don't you think that's a possibility? Doc, you can't be serious. Listen, all I'm asking is for you to wait for the DNA tests, Emily said. 2 days, tops. We'll keep a lid on things until then. For now she's just Jane Doe. I had half a mind to pull my jurisdiction card, but decided that this was probably for the best. Emily was right, the girl was definitely in shock. Telling her parents would only result in a bombardment of emotions she might not be able to handle right now. Not to mention, everyone else in town would want to come see her, and the news vans would follow. I sighed. Fine, we'll do it your way, I gave in. But the minute those tests come back, I'm the first one you call. Of course, Emily smiled. I stood up, winced again at the pain radiating from my shoulder down my arm, and grabbed my hat. Always good seeing you, Doc. Don't be a stranger, Emily said as I walked past her. I signed my release forms and left. So, was it a deer? I looked up from behind my desk, the reports from the other day scattered in front of me, my mind foggy. I had slept very little, constantly dreaming of little Ashley standing in the middle of Hellman Drive bathed in my truck's headlights, staring me down. Her eyes were a strange dark obsidian, and her hair seemed to crawl across her skin, as if alive. I'd swerve, crash and then wake up with a start. Sweating. Gasping for breath. My shoulder screaming. When I'd finally fall asleep again, I'd just get a repeat of the same thing. Over and over, like a film stuck on replay. It kept me up all night. A deer, Dan Wilkins said, smiling. Bastards have a death wish, then. Always prancing about as if they own the damn place. I sighed, pinched the bridge of my nose, and shook my head at my deputy. No, wasn't a deer. Fox, then. Not a fox, I replied. I think I just slept at the wheel. Gotta be careful about that, Sheriff, Dan said, shaking his head and clicking his tongue. Had a cousin who fell asleep at the wheel, God bless his soul. Thanks, Dan, I said with a weak smile. I'll keep that in mind. Dan gave me a thumbs up and made to leave, when he remembered something and turned back. By the way, Doc, Emily called in a few minutes ago. Said it was important. I was instantly alert. Didn't she say it would be 2 days? Message for me? Nope, Dan shook his head. Said she needed to see you urgently down at the clinic. I stood up, grabbed my hat and raced out the door. One of the things about Gloucester I loved the most was how small the town was. The houses were scattered in small clusters around a town center that consisted of only 3 streets with everything crowded next to each other. It brought the community together, I felt, and gave it a kind of charm I had never felt anywhere else. Garvey Road led out of the town center for a few miles north, all the way to an old research facility that had once belonged to the military but had been shut down for years now. There had been talk about turning it into a college, but I doubted that would happen. Besides, a college meant more work for me, and I was quite happy with my current workload. For a long time, Garvey Road had been closed off to stop kids from riding their bikes to the facility, daring each other to explore the place's labyrinth halls and underground labs. Too many accidents had taught us that what was abandoned should be left abandoned. The barricades were removed when Old Man Chester donated a piece of arid farmland to the town to build Gloucester Medical, but it didn't change the fact that the road remained relatively empty. Not this morning, though. It wasn't even noon yet, and for the entire mile stretch it took me to reach the medical center, the road was packed with news vans parked one after the other. Several reporters were standing in front of cameras, microphones in their hands and fake smiles plastered across their faces. Others had made their way to the medical center itself, and were being held back by a few of the nurses and security guards. Shit! I cursed under my breath as I pulled up in front of the center and turned off the engine. A few reporters had spotted me, and through a volley of shouts and waves, the horde made its way towards me. I stepped out, cursing again, and began to force my way towards the doors. "Sheriff, is it true that Ashley Cooper has been found? Who found her? Is she hurt? Do you know who took her? Why won't they let us into the hospital, Sheriff? We have a right to." I pushed my way through the sliding glass doors and immediately called in for backup. The nurses weren't going to be able to hold them off for long, and we were going to need all the help we could get. Emily appeared before I could even make my way to the front desk. "What did we agree to?" she snapped. "Hey, this wasn't me," I said. I kept my mouth shut. "You should ask your staff." "Great, Barker," Emily threw her hands up in frustration. "This is exactly what I wanted to avoid." "Dan and Steven will be here in a bit," I tried to assure her. "We'll make sure they stay outside." "That's not why I called," Emily said, grabbing me by the arm and pulling me along with her. "What is it?" "The girl," Emily said. "She's talking." There was no doubt in my mind that she was Ashley Cooper. She sat in a hospital bed, clad in a gown that made her look like she was 6 again. Her dark brown hair looked a lot less creepy now that it had been combed and pulled back in a loose ponytail, and her eyes had lost that forlorn look she had when I had first brought her in. I smiled at her through the window as I walked past her room, and she smiled back and waved. "She seems good," I said. Emily stopped me before we went in, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "First of all, the DNA tests are not back yet, but from our brief conversation, she says her name is Ashley. She's been asking for Susan and Nick incessantly, but I haven't called them." "Still not 100% sure, huh?" I asked, looking through the window and keeping my smile in place. "I've heard of these things before," Emily said. "Family loses a child, an imposter shows up years later." "Yeah, but they're usually a lot older when they do," I replied. "And usually it's about the money. Even if that's not Ashley, what's she going to do? Rob them while they sleep?" "Just be careful, okay," Emily said. "Besides, she's been acting weird, too. Wants the blinds drawn all the time, no lights. She turns on the water in the bathroom and leaves it running, says it calms her or something." I looked back at Ashley, and her smile had disappeared. She was watching us intently, as if she could somehow read our lips and know what we were saying. Her eyes bore into mine, and for a split second, I felt my skin crawl. It was funny how my feelings towards her could change in the span of a minute. I turned my back to the window. "It could just be PTSD," Emily was saying. "But it's just odd. I don't like it." "The important thing is she's talking," I said. "We'll figure this all out. Are we bringing in the parents?" "I'll have to if she wants to see them," I replied. "That's if those vultures outside haven't already spread the news." As if on cue, we heard shouting from the lobby. Someone was yelling at one of the nurses to let her through. Nancy Cooper made her way around the corner, fighting her way out of the nurse's grip, and ran down the hall. I stood in her way, trying to stop her, but she was already past me and looking through the window at her sister. "Oh my God," she whispered. Her knees buckled, and I quickly wrapped an arm around her waist, holding her up. "Oh my God, it's true." Nancy pushed out of my grip and made for the door. "Nancy," Emily tried to stop her, but it was already too late. Nancy Cooper already had her sister in her arms. "I guess you don't need to call them after all," Emily whispered. I nodded, but couldn't tear my eyes away from Ashley as she returned her sister's hug while staring directly at me. "That is not my daughter," Susan screamed. We sat in a small waiting room on the second floor of the medical center. Nick was staring out the window, that same look on his face that he had had the day of the funeral. His lips moved. He wasn't saying anything out loud, but it definitely looked like he was having a heated argument with some other voice in his head. Susan paced back and forth, hair disheveled, a look of shock and worry all over her face. They had arrived a few minutes after Nancy, and the first thing Susan Cooper had done was slap me hard. Then she started bombarding me with accusations. That I was a terrible man to give them hope like that. That I had no right to play with people's emotions in that way. It was only after we had calmed her down that she had gone on a rampage about how the girl in that room was not her daughter. "Susan, please, shut up, Barker," the woman screamed, pointing an angry finger at me. "You! I could kill you." "Mrs. Cooper," Emily began. "If you'd hear us out. Why the hell did you even tell anyone who she was?" Susan asked, her voice shrill in the small room. "If you were so sure that she was Ashley, why didn't you call us first?" "I wanted to," I said, shooting Emily a look. "We wanted to be sure, first. Dr. Lewis was running some DNA tests. I was waiting for the results. That's not what those monsters outside were raving about." Susan's eyes were full of rage, and she looked at me the way a feral animal would its prey. If given a chance, she would have ripped my heart out with her bare hands. "Susan, you need to calm down," I said. "Calm down? Really, Barker?" Susan hissed. "We hear that our daughter is back, we drive like maniacs all the way over here, and in the end, that person is sitting in a hospital bed, claiming to be my Ashley." "She can claim whatever she wants to claim," I said, my own voice rising, deciding enough was enough. "I already told you that we're doing the tests, and we'll find out soon enough who she really is. She had me fooled, and she's definitely got Nancy fooled." "She's not fooling me," Susan snapped. "Fine," I shot back. "Then go home, and wait for my call." Susan looked like she was about to say something snappy back, but thought better of it and slumped down in a chair. She looked at her husband, realized he wasn't going to take her side, or anyone else's for that matter, and dropped her head. "How long?" We all turned to Nick, who had finally decided to join the party. "Excuse me?" Emily asked. "How long before the tests come back?" She looked at her watch and shrugged. "I asked them to hurry it up for me," she said. "The soonest they'll be able to get back to me is in an hour." Nick nodded, not turning around, standing in that same stoic pose as he stared out the window. "Fine," he said. "We'll wait." I caught Susan look at him, then turn away again. The frown on her face was a clear indication as to how she felt about that. "Could you do me a favor, Sheriff?" "Sure, Nick, whatever you need." I kept my eyes on Susan, though. Her erratic behavior had me on edge, and I didn't need the extra strain on my nerves. "Make sure the reporters don't get in," Nick said. "And keep an eye on Nancy for us." I turned to Emily and raised an eyebrow. When she nodded that she'd be okay alone with the two of them, I turned and left the room. The walk back took forever. Suddenly, my feet felt like lead, slowing me down and making every step feel like a strained effort. Thoughts circled through my head, an inexplicable dread I couldn't place. I had been so sure. How could I have been wrong? A part of me tried to concentrate on the fact that even Nancy was convinced the girl was her sister. But it was Susan's reaction that worried me. A mother would know her daughter, I was convinced of that. If Susan said the girl wasn't Ashley, then she probably wasn't. So who the hell was she? I knocked before finally pushing into the hospital room. Nancy was lying on the bed next to our Jane Doe, holding her in her arms. The girl was asleep, and Nancy quickly put a finger to her lips when I came in. I lifted both hands up and started to retreat when my foot kicked the table. Ashley's eyes flew open immediately, and she quickly sat up, her gaze freezing me in place. "Sorry," I grimaced. "Didn't mean to wake you up." "That's okay," Nancy said when Ashley didn't reply right away. "She's been asleep for a while anyway." "How are you, sweetheart?" I asked, pulling up a chair next to the bed, but still keeping a safe enough distance away. "She's just a girl." "What the hell are you afraid of?" "The eyes. Those twin blues that stared at me as if stripping me of my skin and peeking into the depths of my soul." Nancy patted the girl on the head and gave her a quick squeeze. "It's okay, Ashley," she said. "You remember Sheriff Barker, right?" Ashley nodded but didn't say anything. She looked at her sister, then back at me. "I heard you've started talking," I nudged. "That's great. Real great. I bet you've got a lot of stories to tell." Ashley cocked her head to one side, and for a second I could have sworn those blues had turned a darker shade. "I want Mommy," she finally said. Her voice was a little hoarse, barely a whisper, but cut through me like 1,000 little knives. Almost like nails scratching across a chalkboard. I winced, quickly tried to hide it, but could see she had noticed. "I want Mommy," she repeated. "Sure, sweetie," I replied, forcing a smile. "She's actually here. We just need her to fill out a bunch of paperwork before she can come and see you. Get that stuff out of the way so you could have her all to yourself." Ashley returned my smile, and I felt my mind scream. It wasn't the sweet smile of a 10-year-old. There was something there. Something very, very wrong. "All to myself," Ashley said. "I'd like that." Emily saved me after about 20 minutes of awkward chit-chat and me pretending that everything was fine with the world. She came into the room, claimed that the deputies were asking for me, and gave the sisters one of those smiles doctors saved for patients when they didn't want them to know that something was wrong. She couldn't have picked a better time. I had already started to feel incredibly uncomfortable, and had no idea what excuse I could use to leave. Ashley had spent the entire time staring at me, saying very little, and asking for her mother. I was a few seconds away from screaming at her to just shut up and stop looking at me like that. It made my skin crawl. I started making my way to the front lobby, but Emily grabbed my arm and pulled me in the opposite direction. I followed her silently, a little confused, but mostly worried. She looked pale, and she kept looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone to be following us. She led me to the lab, ushered me inside and closed the door behind us. "She's definitely Ashley Cooper," she said after making sure the door was locked. What? The news hit me like a wrecking ball. I had been ready to believe I was wrong, especially after the way Susan had reacted. "The lab in Hartford called me," Emily said. "They're still writing the report and will email it to me in a bit, but they knew I was in a hurry." "She's an exact match, Barker." "She's Ashley." Then what the hell was Susan's reaction all about? I asked. Emily shrugged and shook her head. "I have no idea," she said. "Denial maybe. She's spent the past 4 years thinking her daughter was dead, and then last night she just suddenly appears out of nowhere. That's definitely got to be hard for her." "That makes no sense," I said. "She'd know her own goddamn daughter. What are you so worked up about?" Emily frowned. "You're the one who was so sure it was Ashley. I would have expected you to be a little happier." "Same back at ya," I said. "I am happy," Emily shot, but her eyes said different. "Then why bring me here?" I asked. "Locked door, empty lab." Emily opened her mouth to reply, then closed it. "You feel it, too, don't you?" I said. Something's just not right with that girl, Barker, she said. Even if she is Ashley. I sighed. I felt it, too, but just couldn't place it. What do we do? Emily asked. Nothing, I said. We need to tell Nick and Susan that their daughters come home. I don't want to be in the room when we tell Susan. Yeah. Me neither. Susan went ballistic. To say she wasn't happy about what we had to tell her was an understatement. Emily had taken it upon herself to be the bearer of the news, and Susan had reacted with a flurry of insults and accusations that would have made a sailor blush. That was closely followed by screaming fits that could have shattered glass, and no matter what I tried to say to calm her down, it only made her angrier. Nick had come out of his stupor long enough to make us repeat the fact that Ashley really was in a hospital bed downstairs over a dozen times. In the midst of his wife screaming and shouting, he had made his way to a corner and had sat down heavily on the floor, his hands covering his face as he rocked back and forth. It was the strangest thing I had ever experienced, and that was even after my short conversation with Ashley that had given me the jitters. A part of me wanted to grab each one in turn and shake some sense into them. To tell them that this was a good thing, that their daughter who everyone had assumed was dead, was back. They had a second chance. Something that not everyone got. Something I personally would have killed for. But I didn't do that. I couldn't. Just watching them react to the news had frozen me in place, and it took a few minutes before I realized that my hand had subconsciously dropped to my revolver. Emily looked ashen, but stood her ground. Her lips were pressed into a very thin line, and she held her head high, ready for anything the Coopers had to throw at her. It took guts and a hell of a lot of confidence to pull that off, and I felt a tinge of pride as I looked at her from the corner of my eye. Susan eventually calmed down, slumped in her chair, exhausted, crying openly. She looked like a defeated woman, and a part of me wanted to take the seat beside her, wrap an arm around her shoulder and tell her that everything would be all right. But the other part of me, the one angry at their blatant ungratefulness, kept me rooted in place. For a second, even the thought of how much they didn't deserve this second chance at a life with their daughter crossed my mind. I quickly pushed that away. We spent another hour with them in the waiting room, saying nothing, patiently letting the news sink in. When Nick finally got up, he made his way out of the waiting room and disappeared down the hall. Emily gave me a concerned look, and I nodded to her to follow him. You don't have to stay with me, Sheriff, Susan said after a few more minutes of silence. I shrugged. You look like you need the company. She scoffed. You probably think I'm a terrible mother. I won't lie to you, the thoughts crossed my mind, I said. She looked at me, but I didn't meet her gaze, keeping my eyes focused on the door and the empty hall beyond. I don't care what the tests say, Barker, she said. That's not Ashley. That's not my daughter. I turned to her then, barely controlling my anger, and took one of her hands in mine. I'm not going to pretend that I know what you're going through right now, I said. But believe me when I tell you I know what you went through 4 years ago. I know the pain of losing a child, what that does to you. How it tears a family apart from the inside out. I lost everything when Holly died, Susan. Everything. I fell into this hole, this dark abyss of a hole that I couldn't climb out of. It destroyed my marriage, and pretty much everything else. I squeezed her hand hard. You just got your little girl back. Think about that for a second before you say something stupid like that again. She looked at me, tears rolling down her cheeks, lips quivering. You don't understand. Do you? I asked. That girl downstairs, she misses her mother. She's been asking about you ever since she started talking. You need to see her, Susan. She shook her head frantically, pulled her hand out from between mine, and quickly stood up. No, she said. No, I can't. I can't. She repeated it like a mantra, walking to a corner where she wrapped her arms around her body and began to cry again. I sighed, stood up and was about to go to her when Nancy came in. "Mom." Susan turned, and with tears, rushed up to her daughter and hugged her. Nancy's eyes grew wide in surprise, and she looked at me for an explanation. "She's a little emotional," I played it down. Nancy's frown deepened, and she hugged her mother back. "Mom, what's wrong? Who's with Ashley?" I asked. "No one," Nancy replied. "She fell asleep, so I came up here to see what was going on." "I'll keep an eye on her," I sighed. "You take care of your mother. Talk some sense into her." I left the waiting room and leaned against the corridor wall. Feeling a little defeated, I took off my hat and ran a hand through my hair. Then the lights went out. "What's going on?" Nancy came running out of the waiting room just as the emergency lights came on, dousing the corridor in a sickening red light. "Not sure," I said, waiting for my eyes to adjust. "Power outage, probably. The generators should kick in any second now." "Okay," she said, looking a little perplexed by this. "I can't remember the last time we had a power outage in Gloucester." Neither could I, and the fact that the generators hadn't started running yet confused me even more. "I'll go check on Ashley," I said. "I'm coming with you." "No, you stay with your mother," I said, already making my way towards the stairs at the end of the corridor. "She's a big girl, Sheriff," Nancy said, catching up to me as we descended to the first floor. We ran into Emily and Nick just as we rounded a corner, apparently on their way to us. "Why aren't the generators working?" I asked. "No idea," Emily said. "We were supposed to have them replaced months ago, but you know Jim. Takes forever to get anything done." I clicked my tongue and pushed past them towards Ashley's room. "You should check on the other patients," I said. "What do you think this is, Hartford?" Emily asked. "The center's empty except for Ashley." "I think I should be grateful about that." "Where's Susan?" Nick asked. "Upstairs," I replied. "Do me a favor, take Nancy and go stay with her. I'll be up in a few." Nancy was about to protest, but I wasn't having it. "Go, already." I waited until they disappeared around a corner, then turned to Emily. "Find Jim and get this place running again," I said. "These red lights are creeping the hell out of me." Emily nodded and rushed towards the main lobby. I walked in the opposite direction, making my way to Ashley's room, hoping she hadn't been scared senseless by the blackout. Creepy or not, she was still just a little girl, and if her mother didn't want to be with her, I was definitely not going to leave her alone. Thinking about what I would say to keep the girl calm and preoccupied, I rounded a corner and came to a sudden stop. Ashley Cooper was standing in the middle of the corridor, just outside her room, looking very much the same way she had when I had first found her. Her hair was matted against her scalp, the dampness darkening the top of her hospital gown, and her eyes glistened in the red light. She looked like she was lost, her head turning in circles, as if she were trying to figure out where she was. "Ashley?" I called out. She turned to me, and I felt my heart skip a beat. Her eyes had lost all their color, a complete black that made me feel like I was looking into a pair of bottomless pits. Her hands twitched and she cocked her head to a side, the same way she had before. Only this time, it seemed like it was an involuntary reaction, as if her head were too heavy for her neck to carry. But what really made my blood freeze and my entire body go cold was her smile. That sickening, dark smile. "All to myself," she said in a voice so deep, it didn't feel like it was hers. The emergency lights went out and I couldn't see a damn thing. I quickly reached for my flashlight and brought it up, aiming the beam at where I had last seen Ashley. But she was gone. That's when the screaming began. I almost ran into Emily at the base of the staircase, the emergency lights going out everywhere, one by one. I could barely see her, but her face reflected everything I was thinking. The screaming was coming from upstairs, from the waiting room. I took the stairs by two, not caring if Emily was close behind or not. My revolver was out, held tight in both hands as I raced down the second-floor corridor. I almost shot Nancy when she ran around the corner and practically threw herself into my arms. "Mom," she was screaming. "Mom." I made sure Emily had caught up before I left Nancy with her and ran towards the waiting room. Nick was waiting outside, staring into the room with wide eyes and his mouth hanging open. I pushed past him, storming into the room just as the power came back on and the lights flickered back to life. I would have lost my mind if it hadn't been for Emily rushing to my side and letting out a small shriek of her own. One she quickly stifled as we both tried to make sense of what we were looking at. Susan Cooper sat in a chair staring back at us with lifeless eyes. Her mouth hung open and to one side, as if it had somehow lost touch with which way was down and had decided to try a different route. Her fingers had dug into the armrests so hard that several nails had broken and blood was oozing down the side of the chair. What made the whole thing worse was that she wasn't alone. Standing by her side, head hanging low and shoulders moving up and down as she sobbed, was Ashley. She looked up at us, and for a second, I saw the same black orbs that had gazed at me just seconds ago. They quickly transformed into her baby blues, and the tears streaming down her face could have been heart-wrenching if I didn't feel like a cold hand had found its way to my spine and was twisting hard. "I wanted to see my mama," Ashley was saying. "Oh God, Barker, get her out," Emily gasped, pushing past me and quickly wrapping the little girl in her arms. She twisted her away from the scene of her dead mother and quickly began soothing her. "You haven't seen her, Emily. You don't know what you're holding. That really isn't Ashley Cooper." Susan was right, Emily. We were wrong, and she was right. I snapped out of my daze, slipped the revolver into its holster, and took a few steps toward Susan's lifeless body. I put a hand to her neck, confirming what I already knew. "Doc," I whispered. "I think this is your territory." When Emily didn't reply, I looked at her. She was staring at Susan with a mix of horror and confusion, as if trying to make sense of what had happened. "Doc." Emily blinked twice and shook her head. "Take Ashley," she said. I took a tentative step back, and was rewarded with a frown from Emily. "Nancy?" I called out. "Nancy, come take your sister. She shouldn't be in here." Emily didn't wait for the older girl to come in, and she led Ashley out, leaving me alone with Susan. I leaned forward, slowly closing her eyes, worried that she might just decide to come back and bite my hand off. I could almost see it happening, and why the hell not? I was seeing a hell of a lot of strange things lately. I turned to Nick, who was still standing at the door. "Jesus Christ, what just happened?" Nick didn't reply. Emily came back in with her stethoscope and bent over Susan, trying to hear for even the faintest sign of a pulse. I could see her squinting, concentrating, the doctor and her hoping that she could still save the woman. After a few seconds, she stood back up and shook her head. "Someone tell me something," I demanded. "She was perfectly fine when I left her." "I don't know, Barker," Emily said. "What I want to know is how Ashley got up here." "What do you mean?" "There's only one way up, and one corridor from her room to here." "How did you not see her?" "The lights went out," I said. "Really? That's what's bothering you?" "The girl's been through enough shock, and now her mother's dead," Emily shouted. "Yes, Sheriff, that's what's bothering me." "Then why don't you ask her?" I yelled back. "Christ, Emily, I have no idea." "I do," Nick said, and we both turned to look at him. "What?" I know how Ashley got here, Nick said, his eyes slowly turning so that he was looking straight at me. Sheriff, we need to talk. We set up in Emily's office. I had instructed Dan and Steve to keep their eyes on Nancy and the girl who, I was now very much convinced, was not Ashley Cooper. She wasn't even your run-of-the-mill imposter if I had any say in it. She was something else entirely, and that something scared me. All ears, I said, pulling up a chair for Emily to sit in while I leaned against the office door. Nick sat on the couch with his hands curled up in his lap, his eyes staring down at the floor. He wet his lips, opened his mouth to talk, and then closed it again. I had a feeling we were going to lose him, and snapped my fingers to get his attention. Now, Nick, I said. Come on. Emily shot me an angry glare, and I ignored her completely, not ready to take any more crap for the night. You'll excuse me if I'm a little slow, Nick said. It's going to take me a few minutes to get my head straight. Of course, Emily said. Whenever you're ready. He's never going to be truly ready. He just lost his wife. I pushed back the cynic inside me and decided to follow Emily's lead. If Nick had answers, I wanted to hear them, and rushing him was probably going to make him shut down again. A few years before Ashley went missing, things at home were not going very well, Nick began. You both know that I work as a consultant. I travel a lot, but most of the work I do is out of my office at home. Freelance consulting. I thought it would give me more time to spend with the family, but what it really does is force me to work odd hours, every day. I am constantly on call, and family time, let's just say that almost never happened. Susan didn't take to it too well. She said I was working a lot more since I took on freelancing, and she resented it. A lot. So much that she started looking for comfort in our wine collection. At first, I thought it was a good thing, something to help take the edge off, keep her off my case while I finished my work. It was slow at first, but gradually became worse. The wine bottles were replaced with even more, and soon we had a collection of brandy, scotch, whiskey, a minibar that would have made my old man proud. Of course, that never helped with the anger. Her temper became worse, and once she became a full-fledged alcoholic, that anger turned into bitterness and resentment. Towards me, the girls, everyone really. She stopped seeing her friends, quit her job. She just stayed home all day, drinking. A tear raced down one cheek, and I waited patiently as he wiped it away and tried to collect his thoughts. A part of me wondered why I had never seen it. Gloucester was a small town, and news traveled fast, gossip even faster. And Martha was the gossip queen. I was surprised she had never told me anything about the Coopers in the midst of all the other crap she was constantly telling me. It became so bad that I had stopped trying to help her and had set up in the guest room. I tried to steer clear from her, keep my distance, and I know that only made things worse. One night while I was taking the garbage out, the bag caught in the fence and tore. Everything spilled out, and right in the middle of all our trash were pill bottles. Not prescription, I could see that immediately. I confronted her, and she lashed out. Apparently, she had been taking oxycodone for quite some time and I had no idea. I was furious, threatened to take the girls and leave if she didn't see a specialist immediately. She got violent, broke things, and I had to leave just so she would calm down. Nick sniffed, ran a hand through his hair, and sat back. He was crying openly now, and the pain in his eyes made my stomach turn. I came home one day when I thought she would be asleep. I wanted to get some of my things, and check in on the girls. She wasn't asleep, though. I walked into the house and found her sitting in the living room with a drink in her hand. Her clothes were drenched, like she had taken a shower in them, and there was this wide smile on her face that scared me to death. When I tried talking to her, she just laughed and shook her glass at me, telling me that everything was my fault. That what happened was all my fault. I wasn't in a mood to argue. I just wanted to take my stuff and go, and see the girls. Nick gasped, bent over and broke into a sobbing fit. Emily leaned over, squeezing his shoulder, whispering something incoherent to him until he slowly nodded and collected himself again. Susan was gone. Drunk and high and making no sense. She told me Nancy was out. Study group. When I asked about Ashley, she just laughed. She went on a rambling fit about how our little girl was an ungrateful brat who just wouldn't shut up. She wouldn't stop asking about you, Susan said. It was just so annoying, she said. I was afraid. I knew Susan could be violent, and I was worried she had taken out her anger on our daughter. I ran up to her room. I wasn't going to leave her with Susan another night. But she wasn't in her room. Was that the day she disappeared? I asked, angry as hell that Nick hadn't told me all of this 4 years ago. Did she run away? Nick broke into tears again, and it was all I could do not to grab him by the collar of his shirt and punch his teeth out. Damn it, Nick, you had us thinking she's been missing for 4 years. I yelled. No wonder she's shell-shocked. Did you know where she was all this time? Nick nodded, and Emily had to stop me from throttling him. You son of a bitch. I yelled. I spent a whole year looking for her, you bastard. A year. Where was she? Where? Barker, calm down. Emily was shouting. Look at me, you son of a bitch. My voice boomed, and Nick visibly cringed as he sobbed. Is that why you wouldn't believe she was back? Tell me. No. Nick yelled. What do you mean, no? I demanded. Are you trying to tell me you knew she'd be back? No, Nick cried. No, no, no. Talk. She shouldn't be back. Nick screamed. She never ran away. She was dead, Barker, dead. Susan had drowned her in the bathtub. She was dead when I found her. I sped down Garvey Road, past the news vans, past the reporters who had set up camp all across the farmlands on either side. I drove like a bat out of hell, tires screeching as I took turns a little too quickly, engine roaring when I pushed down on the gas until the pedal had nowhere else to go. Dan had interrupted us just as both Emily and I had been trying to swallow what Nick had told us. The moment the words had come out of the man's mouth, images of my accident flashed before my eyes. Ashley Cooper, hair wet, dark eyes staring at me. It was impossible to believe, and my mind was screaming, telling me that none of this could possibly be true. But for some reason, it made sense. For some strange, twisted and inexplicable reason, I believed it. I wanted to know more, but when Dan told me Ashley was missing, I forgot all about it. We searched every inch of the medical center, but she was nowhere to be found. And with only one way out, it was highly unlikely she could have slipped past the security and nurses manning the doors. Then again, Ashley Cooper didn't travel around like the rest of us, and I had a pretty good idea where I might find her. The cruiser was a bitch to control, and it took me forever to race past town center and towards the Cooper's old Victorian. When I finally arrived, I jumped out, left the engine running and raced into the woods behind the house. I cut through the foliage as if I were running a marathon, barely keeping myself from falling face first every time I tripped over a fallen branch or rock lying in the way. I could feel my legs burning from exhaustion, my body protesting against the strain it was not accustomed to. But I pushed through it all, forcing myself to run faster. I found her exactly where I expected to, standing at the edge of the lake with her feet just barely in the water. She wasn't skipping stones this time. Stop right there. I yelled, pulling my revolver out and slowing down my pace, approaching her carefully. She turned to me, that same blood-chilling smile on her face, those damned obsidian eyes. I don't know who or what you are, I said, but you're coming with me. Ashley laughed and looked out at the lake again. No, she said. No, I'm not. You killed Susan Cooper, I said. I have no idea how you did it, but I intend to find out. She looked at me again, her smile wider now, and gestured with her head at the lake. My father brought me here. In a boat. Threw me over. The lake was too big for the divers to find me, but that's okay. I could find my own way out. Stop talking, I said. You're not Ashley Cooper. I don't believe that story. I was lying through my teeth, and she could tell, because the second the words left my mouth, she was giggling. My father was good to me, she said, her voice deepening, a hoarseness in it that made me cringe. I don't blame him. My mother. That was different. I was only a few feet away, and in what little light there was, I could see her skin begin to peel off. She took a step into the lake. Don't, I warned. Goodbye, Sheriff, she said. Take care of my sister. She giggled again, then took a few more steps into the lake until the water had reached her thighs. I raised my gun to the skies and fired a warning shot, but it didn't faze her. She kept going. Don't make me do this. I called out. She didn't answer. The water was just over her waist now, and she showed no signs of stopping. I threw caution to the wind and fired at her. The bullet lodged in her right shoulder, but did nothing to slow her down. I fired again, and again. By the time I was out, her head had disappeared below the surface completely, and I was left standing alone at the edge of the lake. I dropped to my knees, my eyes scanning the expanse of the body of water in front of me, looking for any sign of her. She was gone.